Hey guys, welcome to The Strong Young Man. As the society we are living in becomes richer and we have more time to reflect, our minds begin to explore all sorts of concepts. One of the concepts we often find ourselves thinking about is how we can remove discrimination of all kinds. We desire to make things as fair as possible, and with a rich society, why can't we achieve this utopia? Many social policies align with this ideology, and so things have improved a lot over the last 100 years. True oppression in the modern Western world is actually pretty hard to find. The poor are getting richer, infant mortality has decreased, and literacy has increased across the world. Political correctness goes against this reality. It's the belief that we're suffering under a bad system. It trains people to feel victimised by the people who run the system and to protect this vision by any means necessary, even if it means falsifying facts. Political correctness permits people to create a melodrama about falsified oppressions that afflict certain minority groups, including blacks, women, and homosexuals. It conditions people to believe that by joining or following the politically correct authoritarians, you are virtuous, and if you don't, you are evil. Understand that very few people are truly oppressed in the modern Western world, and almost all of the disparities that the politically correct authoritarians are trying to fix actually come about by the bullshit programs, solutions, or activities aimed at removing the initial disparity to begin with. Despite the good intentions, social programs implemented by liberal governments that listen to these politically correct authoritarians only intensify the problem by exacerbating the problem or inverting the problem to a bigger degree. Political correctness often exacerbates existing problems by sending minority groups further backwards through unforeseeable vectors. Example number 1. In 1890, African American males had finally reached parity in employment rates a mere 40 years after the abolition of slavery. In a bid to close the racial gap in household income, which was approaching parity by 1960, Lyndon Johnson brought in the welfare state, which afforded extra finances to the low-income earners and the unemployed. The effect this had was that the low-income earners who were closer to the poverty line stopped working to obtain welfare benefits, which often exceeded their wages. More blacks were in this position proportionally than whites at this time, and so this increased the disparity. Blacks became poorer relative to whites after the inception of this policy. Another cascading effect from the US welfare system was that the mothers of low-income earning families were financially incentivised to divorce their husbands in favour of marrying the government. This happened on a much larger scale in the black community. The tax breaks and parental income of the family unit was often not enough to offset the income earned from the government through divorce. With fathers out of the homes, the blacks began sliding into the economic turmoil they find themselves in today. The current understanding of the politically correct authoritarians is that systemic racism and the lingering effects of slavery is what's causing blacks to remain behind today. But slavery in the historical sense has not existed in Western culture for over 150 years. It doesn't make sense to say that the negative effects of slavery increased the further blacks moved from the time of slavery. Blacks were becoming closer to economic parity in the early 1960s, but had since gone backwards relative to the average. For this argument to hold any weight, it would mean that there are still slaves in America today, or that America is more racist than it was 60 years ago. Another aspect of slavery that the politically correct authoritarians neglect to mention is the real history of slavery. Archaeological evidence to support the practice of slavery has been found all across the globe in hunter-gatherer tribes since before language was developed. The word slave is actually derived from the Slavs, whites, who inhabited a large part of Eastern Europe and were taken as slaves by the Muslims of Spain during the 9th century AD. In addition to this, in the 17th century, Barbary coast pirates from North Africa sailed up into Europe and captured and enslaved over 1 million whites and took them back to the Barbary coast. Barbary Coast pirates enslaved more Europeans, mostly Italians, Spanish, Portuguese and French, than Americans took African slaves to the United States and the colonies to which it was formed. White people were enslaved in Africa in greater numbers and nearly a century before the Atlantic slave trade. In fact, the Atlantic slave trade was a transaction where blacks from Africa enslaved their own people and then traded them to the Americas for weapons and alcohol. Most commonly, throughout history, slaves have been captured by their own people of the same race. There is way more publicity surrounding blacks being enslaved by whites, but historically the reverse occurred too. These facts are almost never mentioned. Reality has been stood on its head so a couple of people can gain the upper hand through notoriety and power. Example number 2. In the 21st century, it has become morally fashionable to falsely believe that white men in Western countries continue to exploit and oppress minority groups. Examples include Indigenous Australians in Australia, the Maori in New Zealand, African Americans in America, and African Asians in Europe. In general, these minority groups achieve lower test scores in high school than their white counterparts in these countries. To correct this inequality of outcome, some universities have implemented affirmative action to discriminate against the races they deem as privileged because they achieve better high school grades. This makes things worse for everyone, especially the minority groups that it's targeting to benefit. By lowering the barriers to entry for college and universities, the ones admitted are outperformed by their white classmates. Lagging behind, they eventually drop out. This costs them time, money, and morale, sending them several steps back in life at such a crucial time. The politically correct authoritarians pay no price for being wrong, but the black community that they supposedly care about does. And so it is, indeed, the systemic racism that is causing blacks to fall behind economically, but it's the systemic racism implemented, targeted at improving the lives of minority groups that causes this problem. Unfortunately, politically correct authoritarians aren't intelligent enough to understand that treating everyone equally based on merit is the only way to true racial equality. To create a melodramatic social movement targeted at making one race privileged at the expense of the other is the definition of institutionalised racism, and it is pure evil. Liberals have wreaked more havoc on blacks than the supposed legacy of slavery they talk about. Thomas Sowell. Political correctness can also invert existing problems. The interventions sometimes overcompensate by causing the minority groups to become so privileged that everyone else becomes oppressed, for real. Politically correct authoritarians never keep an eye on the social pendulum that swings back and forth and are unable to see when their work is done. This correction and then overcorrection creates a lagging yo-yo effect that is not forthcoming of a stable society. Carl Jung was the first to elaborate on the psychology behind this principle. He termed it enantiodromia, borrowed from Heraclitus' writings from Greek enantios meaning opposite and dromos meaning running course. Enantiodromia is the emergence of the unconscious opposite over the course of time. The concept is in essence like equilibrium, where any system will try to restore itself to its natural state if it gets too far towards either extreme. Jung emphasised that this phenomenon practically always occurs when an extreme one-sided tendency dominates conscious life. In time, an equally powerful counterposition is built up, which first inhibits conscious performance and then subsequently breaks through the conscious control. Example number 1. The feminist movement's main objective is to punish men to avenge for the inequalities of outcomes between men and women. The idea that we can punish men in order to achieve cosmic justice for women has actually inverted the problem, and men aren't afforded the same civil liberties as women in the 21st century. Women get paid more for the same work compared to men, they have more civil rights than men, and are more protected than men. I broke this down in episode 118. Feminists often argue that this cosmic justice is warranted, but I argue that this attitude only inspires a deadly, never-ending cycle of revenge and counter-revenge, which will only segregate the sexes completely. The problem with these politically correct authoritarians surrounds their inconsistencies. They always begin by asking for special protection for that minority group from bullying, then once the protection is secured, ends up bullying those who oppose them. They ask for respect for their own beliefs and then they end up disrespecting others who differ in beliefs. They operate behind a veil of good intentions, but never achieve good outcomes, and then they blame the system or society when their solutions to the problem don't work. Despite demanding others to be flexible in their thinking, politically correct authoritarians are completely rigid themselves. Most of the time, they are too arrogant to even consider that their solution to the problem might not work, or that it may be causing more harm than good. They also aren't capable of hearing a different perspective, and they become upset or offended to any opposition. They are the first to profess that they are the most tolerant of all human beings, tolerant of differing religions, races, sexual orientations, and disabilities, yet the politically correct authoritarians have a zero-tolerance policy towards diverse opinions. True diversity should always incorporate diverse thoughts and ideas, as well as cultures. Political discussions about the challenges we face as a species should always be held cooperatively, with controlled argumentative dialogue. This is the foundation of democracy, free speech, and the scientific method. To stop permitting the peaceful coexistence of different perspectives is to live under a dictatorship. In fact, the term politically correct first appeared in the 1930s, where it was used to describe dogmatic adherence to the ideologies in authoritarian regimes such as Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. George Santayana. Similar to Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, the intelligentsia starts programming the youth by using any vector available to them to condition their society. The powers that be condition people to believe that certain groups of people oppress blacks, women, and homosexuals. The media, social media, school teachers, university teachers, sports, and movies are the most effective ways of brainwashing impressionable young men and women. This programming leaves young people, especially white heterosexual males, completely lost and hating themselves. In an attempt to feel better, weaker-minded individuals are turning to political correctness to alleviate the guilt that they have been brainwashed to feel. Many people are also turning to political correctness out of fear of speaking out against these radical left-wing ideologues. Others are joining the movement because it gives them an experience of social support. The chemical responsible for rewarding in-group bonding is oxytocin, and politically correct authoritarians become addicted to the oxytocin signalling in the brain. They commonly take offence anytime someone speaks out against them. To these people, taking offence gives them victim status, fortifying their position as the angels fighting against the forces of evil. Climbing to the top of the victim hierarchy means that they can get away with anything, and if you join them, you too will be above reproach. The politically correct authoritarians advocating for a minority group different to their own are the evilest of all politically correct authoritarians. They behave this way because they feel an overwhelming, irrational sense of guilt towards these minority groups. They feel guilty because they've been brainwashed to believe that they are responsible for the behaviour of generations past. I'm not saying that it's not everyone's responsibility to help fix the problem. I'm saying that people today are not to be viewed as responsible for causing the problem. The guilt of the politically correct authoritarian causes them to feel obligated to do something about any and every social problem to cure every social disparity. To do this, the politically correct authoritarian requires some program, solution, or activity to fix these disparities in order to alleviate their guilt. Whether or not it's the correct program, solution, or activity is irrelevant. They simply must do something. They undertake this program, solution, or activity even when there is no objective reason to believe that what they are doing can solve the problem, or when in actual fact it will probably exacerbate the problem. Their primary motive is not altruistic, to cure the problem. It's to appease their guilt and appear virtuous in the process. In fact, the success of any program, solution, or activity would be a problem for them, because then they would need to invent another moral melodrama to achieve this objective. There is plenty of dark psychology going on in the politically correct authoritarian's mind. The first tendency that I have noticed is that they possess an extremely destructive manifestation of the self-categorization bias, where individuals perceive collections of people, including themselves, as part of a group. Once the members of a particular social group have been determined, people are categorized based on this. The politically correct authoritarians who fall into any or multiple of the so-called privileged groups, such as white heterosexual men, need a way to escape their social identity category, and the easiest method of doing this is through political correctness. They form a new social identity, identifying themselves as a person of righteousness, fighting against the forces of evil. The politically correct authoritarian's program, solution, or activity often seeks to reward a particular minority group to make up for the wrongs done to the ancestors of that particular minority group in the past. Even worse is when they blame and punish the other group of people for anything any member of that group of people did historically and in the present. This is so wrong. It's as wrong as sending a child to jail for a crime committed by their parents. This was actually something that did happen in Russian totalitarian regimes in the 20th century. They contend that if you are not with us, you are against us. We are 100% righteous, they contend, and so if you oppose us, you must be 100% evil. This psychological trait of dichotomous thinking, or black and white thinking, is known as splitting, and is something that is observed among those with dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as split personality disorder. Politically correct authoritarians believe that people are either all good or all evil, with nothing in between. Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde. This black or white thinking makes it easier for them to rationalise their evil conduct towards other members of the evil group. It's no big deal, they think, because it's not that bad to do evil towards a person categorised into the evil social identity category. The next bullet they shoot is the virtue signalling bullet, where they publicly express opinions or sentiments intended to demonstrate one's good character. Their behaviour is evidence to others and to themselves that they are more tolerant, loving and caring than others. Due to their dichotomous thinking, they are able to disidentify with their evil side, and their self-categorization shifts from a member of the evil group to a member of the virtuous group. Splitting is a defense mechanism employed by psychologically damaged individuals to protect them from confronting the darker aspects of their personality. If these damaged individuals can show that they are virtuous in one particular instance, then the darker aspects of that person's personality recede into the shadows. Most politically correct authoritarians take it one step further and project the evil aspect of their unconscious onto people who oppose their view. The undesirable qualities that the politically correct authoritarian unconsciously perceives themselves as possessing can be consciously attributed to another through projection. When you challenge a politically correct authoritarian, you are threatening to bring the evil side into their conscious mind. The thought that any part of them is causing the problem is insufferable, and so they will employ a defense mechanism to allow them to hold on to their favorable view of themselves, and the most common defense mechanism is projection. Projection is the preferred defense mechanism for people with narcissistic personality disorder or borderline personality disorder, and it serves to enable them to avoid confronting uncomfortable realities that live in their subconscious. These people are denying the evil aspects of themselves that exist within, something that everyone has, which I addressed in episode 19. Understand that this approach is not healthy. Everyone has evil tendencies, and burying them will result in them rising to the surface in unintended ways. One example of this projection manifesting in politically correct authoritarians is how they became violent in the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. These people harmed other people in order to prove that blacks should not be harmed in custody. A similar paradox occurred in Britain in 2018. Vegan activists who opposed the harm of any sort towards living things became extremely violent towards farmers, including issuing death threats to fight against the harm of all living things. These protesters were allowed to protest with impunity, protected from any social consequences. Anyone intelligent enough to see the problems with the politically correct authoritarians' program, solution, or activity and then challenge them will be labelled as evil. Just understand that they are only projecting their unconscious evil shadow side onto you. In reality, you are only evil to the politically correct authoritarians because you are bringing dark thoughts into their conscious mind, causing them suffering, while at the same time depriving them of a moral melodrama and the opportunity that allows them to signal to the people that they are on the side of righteousness fighting against the forces of evil. To the young men out there, use the knowledge outlined in today's episode to understand these politically correct authoritarians and the method to their madness. Some politically correct authoritarians' hearts might be working properly, but unfortunately, their brains are not. This will help you to remain rational when confronted with their garbage. At the same time, you must be extremely careful to resist the human tendency to conform. Don't succumb to the bandwagon or group effect. If you feel the pressure, then just remember St. Augustine's words. Right is right even if no one is doing it. Wrong is wrong even if everyone is doing it. Don't get sucked into becoming a politically correct authoritarian yourself. It's pure evil. It'll affect your ability to think rationally, use deductive reasoning, and solve societal problems. Strong men don't get swept up in their emotions, irrational thoughts, or hedonistic pleasures of oxytocin signaling. We have the ability to rationalize problems by observing data and studies rather than following the crowd like sheep. In the words of General George S. Patton, if everybody is thinking alike, then somebody isn't thinking. It's important then that you stand up to these imbeciles. Strong men take a stand to anyone threatening the well-being of them and their community. If you don't stand for something, you will fall for anything. Alexander Hamilton. In order to truly see the issues at heart, you need to remove all personal attachment and biases surrounding the issues. These biases can cause an inability for you to effectively and logically evaluate the opposite side of your argument. Although the politically correct authoritarians allow these unconscious biases to control their behaviour, rational men are better than this. Taking a firm, inflexible, arrogant stance will only shut yourself off from the perspective of others and you will never learn anything new. Instead, ask questions to gauge the perspective of others. Gather all the information available on the issues at hand. Then you can present your arguments respectfully, built on rationality, rather than dismissing it aggressively, built on emotionality. Cooperative argumentative dialogue between individuals is known as the Socratic method, to which Socrates and other philosophers methodically sorted through ideas and suppositions. When we explore issues within society, the best approach is to have an open mind. Be flexible in your thinking, never sitting too far to the extreme of one side of the spectrum. Constantly pause to reflect on the current state of affairs. Listen and be open to new information that may reflect your hard work correcting societal issues. There will come a time where you have leveled the playing field. Learn when your work is done and redirect your energy into another creative endeavour. Thanks for watching today's episode. In episode 129, I'll talk about narcissism. Subscribe and click the bell icon to be notified when it drops. Catch you then.